already come through the hard times. And so when they're telling you about what they've done or how they feel or this love for Christ or this faith in his strength, it's because it's already over. The situation is already done with, and they've successfully come out on the other side. But if you read the two verses before it, it gets a greater understanding of what Paul is saying. Now, this is Paul, and Paul is in jail. We currently are studying the book of Philippians. So Paul is in jail, and this is an epistle, a letter that he's writing to the church at Philippi. We know here that Paul is in chains. He tells us that in the first chapter. But Paul is writing this encouraging letter, but he's also talking about his suffering. He says that when you get with Christ Jesus, when you decide to follow Christ Jesus, when you abandon all other things to be with Christ Jesus, you suffer. He says that you will suffer things. And so when in this suffering, though, you have to appreciate it. In this suffering, you will appreciate it. Why? Because this suffering will strengthen you. And so Paul is while being encouraging, he's not being misleading. Paul is letting you know that when you have chosen Christ, it's a very hard road to hoe. Nothing easy about this following Christ. Yes, there are pleasures and there are great things that will happen to you and you will be blessed, but there are other things that will happen. And when those things happen, in your time of famine, you must also realize that the Lord has put you there for a reason. There's going to be suffering in your valleys of your life, and you need to understand that so that when you have plenty on the top of your hill, you will understand that he was with you at the bottom and he was with you at the top. And so Paul is preparing those in Philippi, is strengthening them, getting them ready to let them know that, hey, I'm in chains. And yet in chapter 1, as we talk today, he says, and yet it's for the betterment of the gospel that I am here. So here in verse number 11, I'm going to read from the NIV this morning for the clarity, for the simplicity of the language. The message is the same, the substance is the same, but the language is different. Verse number 11 says, I am not saying this because I am in need, for I have learned to be content whatever the circumstance. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. And this is when Paul says, and I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. And so Paul is letting you know that he's been up and he's been down. He's been with, he's been without. He's one of the haves and he's the have-nots. And at all times, he pushed through because it was Christ who strengthened. And so we should look to Christ this morning. This sermon is about who do we turn to get us through, right? Who do we turn to get us through, right? So most of us, if we're honest, we want to turn to ourselves. We think we're the answer, right? Now in church, we'll be play humble and we'll say, no, that's not true. I turn to Jesus. But if we're honest, most of the time, we turn to ourselves first to get us through. And who do we turn to get us through is us. And us oftentimes isn't strong enough. Us can't move mountains. Us can't turn nothing into something, but Jesus can do it. Amen. So there are examples. Jesus can turn something or nothing into something. Mm-hmm. I was thinking about this when I was putting this together. Bill Gates is now terrible for him. I think he's only the third or fourth richest man in the world. It's tragic. It's tragic. That his $100 billion is just not enough to get him over the top. But when he was first out starting Microsoft, he had this vision that he would have a desktop computer on every desk and be running his program. What was interesting about it was his software, or his machine software, had yet to be invented, but he saw it. And his mother was, I think his family owned a bank, and his mother sat on the board, and it just so happens that on this board was an executive from IBM. And so they got to talking one day, and how's your son? She said, oh, he's doing good. You know, they got this little computer company going on, but they can't get this program thing, you know, the software the machine works on. He said, oh, well, you know, we have this DOS software that we can't use. We can't seem to find a purpose for it. We're willing to work it out, give it to them, right? So for a nominal fee, I can't say it was free, but I know it's nominal. IBM gives Microsoft DOS. And what they gave him was nothing to them that they turned into something. It is literally the background for every Windows system, even today, right? So they're nothing that they could do nothing with now has Bill Gates in the paltry amounts of hundreds of billions of dollars. He has given away, I think, 125 billion, something like that, to charity. It's ridiculous. But if we look at John chapter 2, verse 1 through 11, we see Jesus' ability to take a nothing that's to some other people and to turn it into a something for everybody else. John chapter 2, for those that are familiar, this is Jesus at the wedding. I believe this is his first miracle. And wouldn't it be great that your first miracle be at a party, right? Because I've always liked this Jesus. It lets you know he's not a stoic person, right? You know, he's Jesus. And he's cool to me. It's my impression of him. He's at a party. We know that he's personable because he's not hanging out with his mom. She has to actually go over and talk to him. It says on the third day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. So the whole gang was there. Jesus with his guys, his moms, and you know at that time, the men were here, the women were there. So when the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to Jesus, they have no more wine. Now, what's great about Jesus is you don't need a whole bunch of explanation for Jesus. You don't need to tell him all the rundown of your problem, right? You know, Jesus, I'm broke, right? You don't need to tell him how you got broke, right? You don't need to tell him how you wasted your money or what you bought this foolishness on. You could just go to Jesus and say, I made a mistake. He knows your mistake. You don't need to hear how you got here, right? They have no more wine. She didn't say they have no more wine because these people are gluttonous. They have no more wine because they didn't order enough. They have no more wine because he's cheap. Just they have no more wine. And so when you go to Jesus at nothing, when you're with Jesus and it's a nothing, he can turn it into something. So she goes and she says, they have no more wine. And Jesus doesn't even say, you know, mother, I love it the way he says, woman, why do you involve me? My hour has not yet come. And I know I've preached on this before, but I just love his mother because she's a real mom. She don't have time for his foolishness. She says, she tells the servants to do whatever he says. Why? Because she's his mother and she knows I only need to tell you one time. When you ask Jesus something, yes, prayers of the righteous prevaileth much, and consistent prayer. Yes, but listen to this. She told Jesus one time, you only really need to ask one time. And Jesus can turn your emptiness into something else. And so she says, they have no more wine. She wasn't even descriptive. She figured he'd understand. She told the servants, do what he says. And Jesus looked around and he saw 6 stone water jugs, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. So ceremonial washing means they were big, so big tubs. And Jesus said to the servants, fill the jars with water. So they filled them to the brim. So even Jesus doesn't have to be descriptive. He's that powerful. Just put this water in. He's got a plan. He already knew what he was going to do because he saw what he needed to do it with. He can take other people's nothing and turn it into something. He told them, now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet. They did so, and the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned to wine. So they didn't see it get turned to wine. They just threw a little water out. By the time they carried it to where it needed to be, it was what it needed to be. You don't need to see Jesus do it. You just need to know it'll be done when it needs to be done. When you get there, it'll be okay. So he tasted it. It was turned into wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you saved the best till now. What Jesus does is he doesn't just give enough, he gives the best. He doesn't just take you out of your situation, he takes you beyond your situation. He doesn't just improve where you stand, he makes better where you were. And so the master here is the one over the party. He even knew that there should be weak wine at this point. And he had been drinking good wine in the beginning. And yet he could taste that this wine that Jesus made was better than all that had preceded it. What Jesus is going to do for your life is better than all that had preceded it. And we need to understand that, and we need to recognize it. We need to recognize that we can't do it. Because what we had at that party was water. And what we would have had at that party was still water. What IBM had was a program useless to them. And what IBM would still have would be a program useless to them. But here, Jesus saw their nothing and turned it into something. Who do we turn to get us through? Right? And so, what happens when we think what we have isn't enough? So we know now that Jesus can take a nothing and turn it into something. A person's nothing turn it into something. But what happens when we think what we have isn't good enough? When we think what we have isn't enough for us, when we think what we have can't get us through. We can go to John chapter 6, verse number 1 through 12. That's John chapter 6, verses 1 through 12. Now, who do we turn to get us through? Here, we find ourselves where we have, but what we have isn't enough. You know, we hear that saying, I have too much muff, and too little money. Right? My month lasted beyond my month.